Hey everybody, my name is Jack and I'm here with Pastor Rob from the United Methodist Church in Jackson, Minnesota. And today, what is the sermon going to be about?
Well, Jack, today we're into the season of what's called Epiphany. And that's the season of the Christian year when we see Jesus starting his public ministry, and with the disciples and with the people that he comes in contact with. And so we're going to be talking about Jesus calling the disciples, with the guys that became the apostles, and learning about them, who they are. And we might learn some interesting things about them, that they're not these great spiritual guys. They're regular people. And some of the lessons that we learned from the disciples, from the apostles, and who Jesus chose as his followers is what we're going to be talking about this week and next week. Okay, thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But for those of us who were born and raised in the church in that sense, Epiphany is, and the stories of Epiphany, we know that Jesus, when he started his public ministry, that Jesus met certain people and did certain things, introduced himself to the world in essence. And that's what Epiphany is all about. The aha! This is Jesus. For example, the baptism of Jesus. We kind of skipped over that. I've talked about that in previous years. But the baptism of Jesus. John, his cousin, is baptizing in the River Jordan. And he says, "After me will come one who is, I am unfit to untie his sandals." And then Jesus appears by the River Jordan, and he comes down to be baptized by his cousin John. And we go, ah! And then there's the first miracle, the turning water into wine at Cana of Galilee. And people go, oh my goodness, how did this happen? Aha! It's Jesus again. And so the next couple weeks, though, I want to focus on Jesus calling his disciples, because there's something unique about those disciples in the fact that we think of them as the apostles, the 12 apostles. And when we think of them now, we think of Peter and John and James and Andrew and all these apostles who are these great men of faith. But it's interesting how they were called and how they responded to Jesus the first time Jesus said, "Come and follow me." And what they were doing and who they were. Because I think, as I've been looking at them over the last few weeks in preparation for these messages, they're not a whole lot, they're not a whole lot different than we are. Yes, they lived 2,000 years ago. They had different technology, different things they did, and how they lived. And obviously they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have the modern conveniences we did or we do. But as people, what were their personalities like? Who were they, and how did they react to who Jesus was and is? And what effect did Jesus have on them? And so I think looking at the call of the disciples is something where we look at ourselves and we say, oh, this is interesting. Jesus uses various people. So in John chapter 1, this is where we want to begin. If you have your Bibles, open them to John chapter 1, and we're going to look at the call of the first disciples. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation this morning, and looking at the call. Now, I should say before we read this that for those of us who are familiar with the story of Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four Gospels. There are different accounts. Remember, the four Gospels are 4 eyewitnesses. And in fact, there are some that believe and hold that, in fact, not totally just 4, but there may be more than a few people who contributed their input to whoever was writing the Gospels. And the fact that there could be less than 4, because one of the Gospels Mark would have come out first, or would have been made public first, and so other people copied his. And so there's interesting ways of looking at the gospel accounts, because the way that the disciples were called is sometimes different in the different accounts. And we're going to look, you'll see that especially next week when we look at the call, the specific call of, for example, Simon Peter and John and James. But for now, we're in John chapter 1, Jesus calling the first disciples. And here we are, we're actually in John chapter 1. We have the baptism of Jesus. And then we see Jesus coming back and calling the disciples. And so in verse 35, we read this. The following day, John was again standing with two of his disciples. As Jesus walked by, John looked at him and declared, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." When John's two disciples heard this, they followed Jesus. When Jesus looked around and saw them following, he said, "What do you want?" They replied, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come and see," he said. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they went with him to the place where he was staying, and they remained with him the rest of the day. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of these men who heard what John said and then followed Jesus. Andrew went to find his brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah," which means the Christ. Then Andrew brought Simon to meet Jesus. Looking intently at Simon, Jesus said, "Your name is Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas," which means Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Come, follow me." Philip was from Bethsaida, Andrew and Peter's hometown. Philip went to look for Nathanael and told him, "We have found the very person Moses and the prophets wrote about. His name is Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth." "Nazareth," exclaimed Nathanael. "Can anything good ever come from Nazareth?" "Come and see for yourself," Philip explained. As they approached, Jesus said, "Now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity." "How do you know about me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus replied, "I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you." Then Nathanael exclaimed, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Jesus asked him, "Do you believe this just because I told you I had seen you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than this." Then he said, "I tell you the truth. You will see heaven open and the angels of God going up and down on the Son of Man, the one who is the stairway between heaven and earth." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What a great story. The stories of the calling of the two disciples, of these disciples. And as we look at them, you'll notice I actually didn't start in verse 43 where the bulletin says that the lesson would begin. I began with 35 because we pick up Andrew as well in this calling of the disciples. Here he is. Andrew, you notice, is one of those disciples that was following John. That was inside. I mean, if you're a disciple, you're a follower. You're one that wants to know more about that person and about their teaching. I had a good friend, Doug Deal, who was a minister in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And he was a disciple of Dr. Donald Joy, one of our professors at seminary and everything. And he had read and followed Dr. Joy and read all of his books and stayed with him and everything. So that's what a disciple is. Some people who have an unhealthy following might be considered a sycophant, but a disciple is one who earnestly wants to know and learn. And so that's what Andrew was. And he's Simon Peter's brother. He's the one who goes and gets his brother and says, "We have found Jesus." Andrew, we don't know too much about him after this calling of his brother and having his brother come and say, "Hey, we found the Lord." But I bet you know people who are like Andrew. You might be like Andrew. I had a fellow in my church in Howard, South Dakota, who was like Andrew. He was a salesman for a firefighting supply company. I guess I didn't know that was a job, but I guess the firefighters have to get their supplies from somewhere, and so that's what he did. And but he was just a mild-mannered, nice fellow, everything. But he was the kind of fellow that when somebody new moved to town, he was usually one of the first people at their door, saying, "Hi, my name is John Smith, and welcome." And this is what we have in Howard. This is this is where everything is, and welcome. And by the way, I belong to that church down the street, and I'm on the other side of town. And if you'd like to come, we'd love to have you. Can I pick you up tomorrow, next Sunday? And let me bring you to church. And the interesting thing is, John Smith, I'll just call him John Smith, is that he was never the person to stand up. In fact, he would, if the person that put together all the liturgists, the liturgist list to lead in prayer, he'd go, no, I don't want to do that. You might see John at the church dinner cleaning up afterwards, but he wouldn't be going from table to table introducing himself. He wouldn't be going around with coffee. He wouldn't be going around with a dessert tray. He'd be a person, if you had a Bible study, and he'd be the person sitting in that back corner, he was not the person up front. But he was the person that brought people to church, that introduced himself to folks. You'd always see him down having coffee, but he wouldn't be the leader of the table. He would just be the person sitting back there. And that's who Andrew was. That's what Andrew did. That's who he was. He brought his brother. And look who his brother turned out to be. Simon Peter. We hear about Simon Peter every time the Pope is on television. Because where is the Pope? In St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica? Are you kidding me? He is the leader of the church, right, JJ? Right on. Exactly. He's there. That's who Peter is. And that's what Simon did. Dwight L. Moody, I saw a sad article in the paper here last week that the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, a very famous place, is close to declaring bankruptcy, simply because of the lack of students, the high cost of providing an education, and it's kind of sad. But I noticed in the paper that the Moody Bible Institute is close to bankruptcy, named after Dwight L. Moody, one of the great evangelists of the early 20th century, late 18th or 19th century, right around 1910, 1915, that time period. And one of the great evangelists, like the Billy Graham of his day, brought and spoke to thousands and thousands of people, telling people about Jesus. And you know who brought him to Jesus? You know who introduced him to Jesus? A shoe salesman. You think of a shoe salesman as being an evangelist? And here he is. So you never know who you might bring, who you might be involved with, what you might say to somebody. Andrew brought his brother, Simon Peter. And Jesus said, "Upon you, Simon Peter, I'm going to build my church." But do you know the story of Peter? Do you remember the Bible stories of Peter? Peter is not the pure apostle that we think about. Peter is not the guy that you think about, okay, here's St. Peter's Basilica, and the church, the Christian church, the world history has changed because of Peter. And yet, where did he start out at? What did he do? If you remember some of your Bible studies and Sunday school lessons about Peter, Peter's the guy that when Jesus said or Peter wanted to, he was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter and James and John and Elijah and Moses appeared with Jesus, and Peter said, "Lord, this is so great, let's build a house here. Let's build 3 houses and we can stay up on this mountain." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." How would you like to be called Satan by the Son of God? That'd be a pretty bad insult, wouldn't it? But that's who Peter was. He would shout out, he would say, this is who you are, this is what we need to do. And Jesus said, "No. Let's stop here. Let's think about what's going on." And then the most famous story we have about Peter, the most famous encounter, in the upper room, Jesus says, "I'm going to die. I'm going to go to Calvary." And Peter says, "No, I'll follow you. I'll follow you wherever you go, even unto death." And then what happens in the courtyard as Jesus is being tried? Do you remember? He denies him. And Jesus says, before the cock crows, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter says, "I never knew him. I don't know him. You have it wrong. I was never around with him." And he flees into the night crying. But then what happens after Jesus is risen? He meets Peter on the seashore and has breakfast. And says, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" 3 times. And Peter says, "Yes, you know I love you." Jesus basically forgives Peter, and Peter becomes the foundation. There may be people, if you're not a Peter, if you're not a person like Peter who stands up in front of folks and proclaims your faith out loud like that, you may be an Andrew, a person who brings people to Jesus. We always need to be aware of who we come in contact with and who we're around who might influence folks. And then there's Philip and Nathaniel. These guys are 2 of my favorites. We don't know much about them. We know that Philip, later on in the book of Acts, gets whisked away to just this kind of story. It's like it's stuck in the middle of Acts, or in the first part of Acts, and it's just there. Philip is the disciple that is whisked away to witness to the Ethiopian official. If you remember that story, Philip is taken away, and he is brought to the side of the road where a chariot is being driven, and this Ethiopian official is reading, and he's reading the prophet, and he's reading the scrolls, and Philip says, "Do you want me to explain that to you?" And so he witnesses to his faith, and he witnesses to who Jesus is, that Jesus is the fulfillment of these readings. And the Ethiopian official says, "Wow, this is amazing. What must I do to be saved?" And Philip says, "Be baptized and believe, and as a witness to your faith." And so that's what Philip does. But the fun thing about this passage of Scripture is Nathaniel. We don't know much about Nathaniel either. But what we do know is he's probably a lot like us, because he asks a question, or he proclaims something that I know I would say this if I was in Nathaniel's place. Philip goes to Nathaniel and proclaims, "We have found the one who has been written about, Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathaniel has the classic line, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? That backwater? That place?" Have you ever thought that way about Jackson? Have you ever thought about the place that we live? And you go, it's not as famous as Minneapolis or St. Paul. If you mention Burnsville, Edina, you name it, even Fergus Falls might have more people know about it than Jackson, Minnesota. So I did some digging. this past week, and I found a few folks. Have you ever heard of Jeffrey Bullock? Bullock. He's now the president of the University of Dubuque in Iowa. Came from Jackson. Lee Aase, A-A-S-E. You know who he is? He's one of the directors, on the board of directors for the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. Born and raised in Jackson, Minnesota. He's actually one of the pioneers in the use of social media by hospitals. He actually really started that trend. Willis Flygar. You know who Willis Flygar is? Some of you haven't nodded yet. A professor of chemistry at the University of Illinois. He's a leader in the field of molecular chemistry. He actually discovered a molecular microscope thing, that a spectrograph to look at molecules in chemistry. And you go, okay, no big deal. But you never know. There may be diseases and things that, because of Willis Flygar from Jackson, Minnesota. Who knew? And then, of course, we have Stephen Sensky. Many of us know Stephen. He was back for his dad's funeral this past year. And Stephen has been nominated and confirmed. He is serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Agriculture of the United States. From Jackson, Minnesota. Can you believe it? I actually ran into there are many people that were listed from Jackson, Minnesota, who served in the state legislature, and I went, no big deal. I mean, it's I felt like saying, hey, no big deal. But there, you know, the thing is that sometimes we consider, you know, where we live. I remember, I'll never forget the time I was serving in a place in North Dakota, and I had my mom and her sister. My mom's sister at the time was living in St. Cloud. Everybody knows where St. Cloud, Minnesota is. You know, that's where Cumulus U is, you know, the weather university and everything, you know. And everybody knows where people have heard of St. Cloud, Minnesota. But here they were visiting way up in North Dakota. And my Aunt Jean goes, wow, Robert, you live in the boonies. And I said, and after my Aunt Jean left, I called my mom and I said, Mom, do I really live in the boonies? I don't want to live in the boonies. And she says, I hate to tell you this, Robert. You do live in the boonies. You do. But you know, where we live, where we come from, it's amazing the kind of influence that we can have. The people that come into our lives, the people that God has given us, whether it be young people who know our kids and we have an influence on them, whether it be people that we have coffee with, people we're in school with. I was talking with the young people today about the temptations and the trials and the things that our friends might tempt us to do and be involved with. And the choices we make have an influence not only on our lives, but on their lives too. And the influence that we can have. That's what the story of Philip and Nathaniel are all about. Because did you realize what Nathaniel ended up doing? Look at again in John chapter 1. John chapter 1, Philip says, after Nathaniel makes his great proclamation on what good can come from Nazareth, Philip says, come and see for yourself. And as they approach, Jesus said, now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity. And Jesus is talking about Nathaniel, the one that just put down Nazareth. And said, can anything good come from Nazareth? And Jesus says, here's a man of complete integrity. One who speaks the truth, no matter what. And Nathaniel says, well, how do you know me? And Jesus said, I saw you under the fig tree. And Nathaniel proclaims and says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. So when we say something to somebody, when we have an influence, when we have something people say, what's different about you? What's different about you? What's different about how they live their life? And you realize that's the Holy Spirit working and ministering through us to introduce people to Jesus. And say, this is how a Christian lives. And because they believe in Jesus, this is what a Christian does. But also, they can say, I see Jesus in you. It's kind of interesting to see Jesus now through the lives of Andrew and Simon and Nathaniel and Philip. It's kind of easy when they're called apostles. When was the last time somebody called you an apostle? More likely, a person might call you a follower of Jesus. Do people see Jesus in you? Something to think about. Let's pray together. Our Lord God, we thank you for the lessons that we learned and the pictures that we see of Andrew and Simon and Philip and Nathaniel, and how you called them and how you chose them. Just as they were. Andrew, the kind of person that stays in the background, that just quietly says, come on, let me introduce you to somebody. Simon Peter, who stands up and says, I'm going to proclaim Jesus no matter what. And Philip and Nathaniel, two people who are just living their lives, telling the truth as they see it. Lord, help us to find ourselves in the way that you call them, so we can understand how you call us. You call us right where we live. Right, what we do. It may be to our friends at school. It might be at work somehow. It might be in a way that we treat people and how we deal with people. Lord, we ask that you show us how to show you to others in our lives. Help us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. I invite you to take your hymnals as we conclude our service this morning with number 555, Forward Through the Ages. And as a way of concluding our service, we'll sing the first and the third verse. The third verse, not alone we conquer, not alone we fall, in each loss or triumph, lose or triumph all, bound by God's far purpose in one whole living whole. Moving on together to the shining goal. That's what we do as we proclaim Jesus. We move forward. And we're not alone in that. We share our faith because the Holy Spirit lives in us and moves through us. And so we share our faith with others.